If attraction feels unpredictable, it's because most men think it's about behavior, when it's really about identity under pressure. When a woman starts losing interest, she doesn't need explanations. She needs to see whether the man she's with remains himself when the dynamic shifts. That's why she doesn't leave right away. She watches. In that window, 5 secret tests appear. Each one measures something most men were never taught to protect. Their emotional center, their boundaries, their self-respect. Failing these tests doesn't look dramatic. It looks like trying harder, being more patient, being more available. This video breaks down those tests, the instinctive reactions that quietly erase desire, and the difference between being invested and giving up your position without realizing it. Most men are never told this part. Women don't usually wake up one morning and decide they're done. Attraction doesn't shut off like a switch. It fades quietly, through observation, not confrontation. While you're trying to fix things or figure out what changed, she's already watching how you respond to uncertainty. When a woman is no longer fully sure about you, she doesn't leave right away. She stays. She pulls back just enough to see what happens next. Not because she's cruel, not because she's plotting, but because she's asking herself a question she may not even be conscious of yet. Is this man still grounded, or does his stability depend on me staying exactly the same? This is where most men misunderstand what's happening. They assume attraction is lost because they didn't do enough, say enough, or prove enough. In reality, attraction usually weakens through small reactions that feel harmless in the moment. Over-explaining, over-adjusting, over-investing when effort is no longer mutual. None of these feel like mistakes. They feel like trying. But attraction doesn't respond to effort the way logic does. It responds to emotional posture, to how a man carries himself when certainty is removed. That's why these moments are so dangerous. They don't look like turning points. They look like normal relationship fluctuations. Yet each one quietly measures something deeper. Your center, your boundaries, your sense of self when the dynamic shifts. The tests you're about to hear don't show up all at once. They surface gradually, in different forms, at different times. But fail 2 or 3 of them in a row, and attraction rarely recovers. Not because you're a bad man, but because the frame has already collapsed. Understanding this is where everything changes. Number 1, the availability test. This test shows up the moment her interest starts to wobble. Not collapse, just wobble. Her replies slow down. Plans become tentative. She's busy more often. Yet somehow she still expects you to be available when it suits her. This is where most men misread the situation. They think the problem is timing, distance, logistics. So they do what feels reasonable. They stay consistent. They reply faster. They keep their schedule open. They prioritize her, hoping that reliability will stabilize the connection again. It doesn't. Because this isn't a test of your time. It's a test of your standards. What she's unconsciously observing is whether access to you has any relationship to how she treats you. When your availability remains unlimited, while her effort quietly drops, a message is sent, without a single word being spoken. It says that your presence is guaranteed, regardless of reciprocity, and attraction doesn't survive that message. Consistency without mutual investment doesn't create safety. It removes tension, it flattens polarity, desire needs contrast, interest needs consequence. When access to a man never changes, regardless of effort, he stops feeling chosen and starts feeling usable. Men who fail this test often say the same thing later. I was always there for her, and she still pulled away. Exactly. Being endlessly available didn't pull her back. It confirmed that nothing was at stake. Passing this test doesn't mean disappearing, playing games, or punishing her with silence. A grounded man doesn't perform busyness or withdraw out of resentment. He simply adjusts to reality. If communication slows, he doesn't chase it. If plans become uncertain, he doesn't reorganize his life around ambiguity. If effort drops, he notices and responds by matching, not compensating. That adjustment is quiet. It's not announced, and it's deeply felt. When a woman senses that access to you is not automatic, but also not withheld in anger, something shifts. She feels the weight of her own inconsistency. And for the first time since her interest began slipping, attraction has room to breathe again. Number 2, the replacement test. This one is subtle enough to slip past most men entirely. She casually mentions another guy, a coworker, an old friend, someone who helped her out or who she randomly ran into. The delivery is light, almost throwaway. Nothing about it sounds like a threat. That's intentional. This isn't about making you jealous in an obvious way. It's about seeing what happens inside you when the idea of competition is introduced. She's not testing exclusivity. She's testing your internal security. And the moment most men fail, this test is the moment they react. They ask follow-up questions they don't actually want answers to. They subtly change their tone. They feel the urge to reassert value, to remind her who they are, to prove, without saying it, that they're still the better option. Even mild reactions give the same signal: threat detected. Attraction weakens when a woman senses that your confidence depends on being the only option in the room. Because real confidence doesn't need protection. It doesn't flinch when uncertainty appears. A grounded man doesn't compete with ghosts. He doesn't interrogate. He doesn't dismiss her comment aggressively. He doesn't puff his chest or shrink his posture. He stays exactly the same. And that sameness is the point. Confidence is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It's felt in how little you change when comparison enters the space. Here's the distinction most men miss. If she's already emotionally gone, this test turns into replacement behavior. But if she's unsure, this is a probe. She's watching to see whether you collapse into insecurity or remain centered. The moment you start auditioning, explaining why you're different, better, safer, you shift roles. You stop being the chooser and become the one seeking approval. And attraction doesn't recover once a man starts performing for it. Passing this test looks uneventful from the outside. You acknowledge what she says without tension. You don't pry. You don't posture. Your energy doesn't spike or dip. That calm communicates something powerful. I'm comfortable with myself, with or without competition. Paradoxically, that's often what restores attraction. A woman stays interested in a man who doesn't need to be the only option to feel secure, because he feels like a choice, not a position under threat. This is where everything quietly flips. Up to this point, most men think the solution is effort. More clarity, more reassurance, more emotional output. They believe that if attraction is slipping, the answer must be to close the gap by doing more. But when you step back and look at the pattern, a different truth emerges. The men who lose attraction the fastest aren't careless. They're attentive. They're trying. And they're consistently making the same 3 mistakes without realizing it. They over-explain. They over-function. They overreact. They explain their intentions when none were questioned. They take on emotional weight that was never theirs to carry. They react to uncertainty as if it's a problem that must be solved immediately. And here's the shift most men never see coming. Attraction doesn't disappear because you care. It disappears the moment you lose your center. There's a specific point where concern turns into pressure, where presence turns into dependence, where a woman begins to feel, not logically, but emotionally, that she is now responsible for keeping you steady. And that's the moment desire starts to leak, because desire can't coexist with emotional responsibility. A woman can appreciate effort and still feel less attracted at the same time. She may not even know why. She'll just feel heavier in your presence, less free, less drawn. That's why men often say, the more I tried, the worse it got. They weren't trying wrong. They were trying from a place of imbalance. This midpoint matters because the tests that come next aren't about surface behavior anymore. They're not about texts or other men or availability. They're about emotional strength under pressure. From here on, what's being measured is simple but unforgiving. Can you stay grounded when the dynamic shifts, or do you hand over your stability the moment uncertainty appears? What comes next goes deeper, and the cost of failing becomes harder to recover from. Number 3, the pullback test. This one doesn't arrive with words, it arrives with a feeling. She's still there, but not fully. Texts come later. Responses feel flatter. The warmth hasn't vanished, but it no longer reaches you the same way. Nothing specific happened. There's no argument to point to. Just a subtle shift in energy that makes you uneasy. That unease is exactly what triggers the test. On a subconscious level, she's asking a simple question. If I step back a little, does he stay grounded, or does he lose his center? Most men answer that question without realizing they're answering it at all. They chase reassurance. They ask what's wrong. They push for clarity before she's ready to give it. Not because they're weak, but because uncertainty feels intolerable. And that's where attraction begins to slide. Attraction doesn't disappear when a man wants closeness. It disappears when closeness turns into pressure. When her emotional distance becomes something you need her to fix so you can feel steady again. This is why effort applied at the wrong moment feels suffocating instead of caring. The more you push to restore the old dynamic, the more she feels responsible for regulating your anxiety. And the moment that happens, desire drains, even if she can't explain why. Passing this test doesn't require ignoring her or playing cold. It doesn't mean disappearing or pretending you don't care. It means you don't overreact to space. You notice the change, but you don't spiral. You keep your routine. You respond normally when she reaches out. You don't interrogate the silence or demand certainty before it naturally returns. That calm does something powerful. It shows that you enjoy her presence without depending on it. That space doesn't destabilize you. And paradoxically, that's what often makes her feel safe enough to move closer again. This test lives in the middle ground. She's not gone, but she's not sure. Chase her, and you push her away. Stay grounded, allow space without resentment, and you give attraction room to recover. Sometimes, doing less emotionally is exactly what keeps things from slipping further. Number 4. The emotional labor test. When a woman starts losing interest, one of the first things that quietly shifts is how she uses you emotionally. She vents more. She unloads stress more often. Her frustrations, worries, and complaints start landing in your lap with increasing frequency. At first, this can feel like closeness, like trust. You may even take it as a sign that you're becoming more important to her. That's where most men get trapped. Because this isn't a test of how much you're willing to carry. It's a test of whether you have boundaries while staying present. She's watching to see if you can listen without disappearing into her emotional weight. Men fail this test by overfunctioning. They absorb everything. They try to fix her mood. They become the place where every heavy emotion gets dropped. They confuse support with self-sacrifice, believing that being endlessly available emotionally makes them a better partner. Over time, it creates an imbalance. A man who carries too much emotional labor stops feeling like a partner and starts feeling like an emotional container. Attraction fades not because he's unkind, but because he's no longer leading emotionally. He's reacting, managing, carrying more than his share. Emotional leadership isn't about rescuing her from her feelings. It's about staying stable while she processes them. A grounded man listens without drowning. He offers perspective without trying to solve what isn't his to solve. He stays calm without becoming responsible for regulating her inner world. And here's the part men don't expect. The moment she senses that her stress is destabilizing you, something shifts. Respect softens. Desire follows. Not consciously, not deliberately. She'll just feel less drawn, even if she can't explain why. That's why some men notice a strange reversal. The more emotionally available they become, the less desired they feel. It's not availability that damages attraction, it's overextension. Passing this test means knowing when to be present and when to let her carry her own emotional process. Sometimes the most attractive response isn't fixing, solving, or absorbing. It's staying grounded and allowing her to regulate herself. This test usually appears when she's deciding whether you're emotionally stable long-term or someone she will eventually outgrow. Number 5. The disrespect probe. This test rarely announces itself. It slips in quietly, disguised as something small enough to ignore. She interrupts you while you're talking. She cancels plans last minute without much consideration. She makes a joking comment at your expense and watches your reaction. Each moment, on its own, feels insignificant. That's why this test is so effective. The disrespect probe isn't about the behavior itself. It's about whether you notice it, and how you respond when your self-respect is lightly challenged. She's not looking for a fight. She's checking for self-regard. Most men fail this test in one of two ways. They laugh it off to avoid tension, or they over-explain why it bothered them. Both responses communicate the same thing. I'll tolerate small losses of respect to keep the peace. And attraction doesn't survive that. Here's the distinction men miss. Attraction doesn't disappear because of conflict. It disappears when a woman realizes you won't protect your own boundaries. When small moments of disrespect go unaddressed, something shifts inside her. She may never consciously think, I respect him less. She'll just feel it. Standing up for yourself doesn't require anger. It doesn't require lectures or emotional reactions. A grounded man doesn't escalate disrespect, but he doesn't ignore it either. He addresses it lightly, clearly, without charge. That response does something powerful. It signals strength without needing to prove anything. It shows awareness without insecurity. And most importantly, it reestablishes the frame. You value yourself enough to correct what crosses the line. When men repeatedly let small disrespect slide, the behavior almost always increases. Not because she wants to push, but because the boundary was never reinforced. Passing this test means recognizing patterns early and responding before resentment builds or attraction erodes. This is why some relationships change without a single dramatic incident. Respect didn't drop all at once. It was traded away in small moments that were never reclaimed. Protecting your self-regard isn't about dominance. It's about presence. And when a woman senses that you won't abandon yourself to avoid discomfort, attraction has something solid to anchor to. When you step back and look at all 5 tests together, a clear pattern emerges. They don't measure perfection. They don't test how romantic you are, how attentive you are, or how much you care. They all circle the same core question. Does this man still have his center? Every test points to it. Availability tests whether you have standards. Replacement tests whether your confidence collapses under comparison. Pullback tests whether distance destabilizes you. Emotional labor tests whether you have boundaries. Disrespect tests whether you protect your self-regard. Different situations, same measurement. Women aren't checking whether you'll never make a mistake. They're checking whether your sense of self survives discomfort. Whether uncertainty turns you into someone reactive, performative, or self-abandoning. Or whether you remain grounded when the dynamic shifts. That's why these tests feel confusing in real time. None of them scream danger. They whisper. And they're spaced out just enough that most men never connect the dots. They respond to each moment emotionally instead of structurally. But attraction doesn't respond to isolated reactions. It responds to the pattern they form. The men who maintain attraction aren't colder. They aren't detached. They're stable. They don't grip tighter when things wobble. They don't overcorrect when effort drops. They don't hand over their emotional balance to someone else's uncertainty. And this is the part that matters most. You don't pass these tests by becoming indifferent. You pass them by becoming anchored, not rigid, not defensive. Just solid enough that shifts in her behavior don't knock you off axis. That's why trying to act confident never works. Confidence isn't behavior. It's the absence of collapse. It's what remains when reassurance isn't immediately available. You don't need to be flawless to hold attraction. You don't need to be untouchable. You just need to be a man who doesn't disappear from himself the moment the dynamic stops feeling secure. That's the thread running through all 5 tests, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. By the time attraction is visibly gone, it's usually already been decided. Women don't walk away because of one wrong sentence or one bad week. They walk away because of a pattern. A series of small moments where a man slowly stepped away from his own center without realizing it. Each reaction made sense on its own. Together, they quietly rewrote the dynamic. That's the part most men miss. You weren't too caring. You weren't too invested. You weren't not enough. What happened is simpler and harder to see. You adjusted yourself to keep the connection alive, and in doing so, you taught her that your stability depended on her behavior. Once that frame sets in, attraction doesn't vanish dramatically. It drains. Here's the truth that actually puts power back in your hands. You cannot control her interest. You cannot force attraction to return. But you can always control how you stand inside the relationship. Attraction isn't something you earn by proving. It isn't something you negotiate with effort. It's something that's preserved when a man maintains self-respect, emotional stability, and clear boundaries, especially when things start to feel uncertain. That's why chasing never works. That's why over-explaining backfires. And that's why the men who keep attraction aren't louder or colder, they're steadier. Attraction is not something you beg for. It's something that responds to grounded presence. If this video helped you recognize moments you've lived through, subscribe. This channel exists to help you see the dynamics most men only understand after it's too late. If one of these tests hit close to home, leave a comment. Awareness is the first shift that actually matters. And if you know another man who's confused, replaying conversations in his head, wondering where things went wrong, share this with him. Sometimes clarity arrives before the loss, and that's when it can still change everything.